On Christmas Eve, a tired Latina waitress named Camila lifted a spoon for a disabled little girl in a crowded diner, never knowing that this quiet act of kindness would draw the attention of a cold billionaire father and set off a chain of consequences neither of them could undo. The small diner buzzed with low chatter and clinking plates, while colored Christmas lights blinked overhead and made everything look warmer than it really was. A tree stood near the window, heavy with ornaments and too many gifts, like a performance put on for strangers who needed to believe the season was gentle. The smell of coffee and fried food clung to the air, fighting the winter that pressed its face against the glass outside. Camila thought it would be just another long shift, the kind you survive by moving fast and keeping your head down. Until she noticed the girl in the wheelchair struggling to eat, and a well-dressed man watching from a distance as if tenderness was something that could be managed like a schedule. What Camila did next wasn't about money or tips or trying to be seen in a place where people in aprons are meant to be invisible. It was about dignity and the stubborn belief that no child should have to battle a simple meal while the world pretends to celebrate peace on earth. She stepped closer as if she belonged there, lowered her voice and let her hands move with the calm confidence of someone who had cared for fragile things before. Camila had no idea that this small choice, made on a night most people would forget by morning, would become the moment that cracked a powerful man's control, and she couldn't yet see that the most dangerous part of the evening wasn't the crowd. It was the silence that came when someone like her refused to look away. Up close, the girl's struggle was quieter than people expect, and that made it easier for everyone else to ignore. Lily's fingers trembled around her fork, her jaw tightening as if every bite demanded more strength than she had left to spend. Camila angled the spoon carefully, giving Lily time, letting the child decide the pace instead of forcing a victory that would only make adults feel comfortable. For a few fragile seconds, Lily's shoulders softened, and the noise of the diner faded into something distant and harmless. Then Camila felt the air shift behind her, the way it shifts when power enters a space and expects the room to rearrange itself. A calm voice stopped her, polished and controlled, the kind that never needs to rise because it has always been obeyed. Camila turned and saw Graham Whittaker stepping into the edge of their booth's light, his suit too perfect for vinyl seats, his expression composed in a way that warned her not to misunderstand the rules. The manager stiffened like a man hearing his paycheck speak, and the nearby tables went quiet in pieces, forks hovering above plates, as if everyone suddenly remembered who mattered. Camila's cheeks burned as she held the spoon mid-air, feeling her job balance on the thin thread of his approval. She started to pull back because she knew what men like him could do with one complaint and a practiced smile. And that was when Lily looked up at Camila, steady and searching, and something rare happened in the middle of all that control. A small smile appeared on the child's face, real, unforced, bright enough to make the diner's holiday decorations feel honest for the first time all night. It wasn't gratitude performed for adults, and it wasn't sweetness meant to soften a punishment. It was simply recognition, as if Lily had found safety in a place that never offered it. Graham saw that smile land on Camila, not on him, and the flicker in his eyes was not anger so much as fear, because it proved his power had limits. In that fragile second, with the spoon still raised and the room holding its breath, the billionaire understood he had just met the one thing he couldn't command. Camila lowered the spoon, with the same care she might use to set down a fragile glass, because in that moment even kindness felt like something that could shatter, and she could feel the entire diner waiting to see what the billionaire would allow her to be. The Christmas music kept playing, bright and oblivious, but the room had changed in a way no decoration could hide. The chatter thinned into cautious murmurs, and the clink of silverware sounded sharper now, like everyone was pretending to eat while secretly listening. Camilla's cheeks burned, not because she regretted helping Lily, but because she knew how quickly a good deed could be painted as disrespect when power felt challenged. She whispered a soft apology she didn't believe, the kind you offer when you're trying to keep your job, not your dignity. And she stepped back, swallowing the bitter taste of being treated like a problem for choosing to be human. Graham Whittaker didn't shout, didn't scold, didn't need to. He stood there with that polished stillness, the kind of silence that makes people straighten their backs and lower their eyes without being told. His suit looked too clean for a diner booth, his expression too controlled for Christmas Eve, and his presence seemed to drain the warmth from the colored lights overhead. Camila felt the manager's nervous attention hovering nearby, ready to translate Graham's smallest reaction into policy, punishment, or praise. It was the kind of power that never sweats, never begs, never explains, because it has always been obeyed. And Camila understood in her bones that he could end her night with a sentence. So she returned to work, because that's what you do when your fear has bills to pay. She wiped a table that was already clean, refilled coffee that hadn't gone cold, carried plates like she could carry herself out of the moment too. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind stayed trapped under the blinking lights near Lily's booth, replaying the seconds over and over. Every forced laugh from the next table sounded wrong, like people were trying to prove they weren't bothered by what they had just witnessed. Camila told herself to disappear into the rhythm of service, to become invisible again, but the memory of Lily's shoulders softening wouldn't let her fade the way she usually could. Across the diner, Graham sat down again, and from a distance the scene almost looked normal. Father and daughter, Christmas lights, a tree glowing like a postcard. Up close, Camila could see the truth hiding inside the picture. Graham adjusted Lily's napkin with careful precision, like he was correcting a detail on a plan, and Lily stared at her plate as if it held a test she was tired of failing. He watched her hands the way a man watches a clock, waiting for the right outcome, measuring seconds instead of feelings, and when Lily's eyes drifted toward Camilla's section, Graham's gaze followed, quick, guarded, like a door being shut before something honest could walk in. Camila felt something tighten in her chest, not anger exactly, but a quiet kind of clarity. She wasn't imagining it. Lily had relaxed with her, and the billionaire had seen it, and that was why the air felt so dangerous now. Graham wasn't just protecting his daughter. He was protecting the story he told himself about being the kind of father money could fix. Camila understood that pride can wear a suit and still behave like a cage, locking everyone inside it, including the person who built it. She kept serving, kept smiling, kept performing calm, while her heart refused to call cruelty order. And beneath the glitter and the forced cheer, she realized this wasn't over, because Lily's smile had landed like truth, and truth doesn't disappear just because a powerful man wants it to. Camila finished the shift the way she finished most things, quietly, carefully, with her feelings folded away where no one could charge her for having them. Yet Lily's smile followed her like a soft light she couldn't switch off. After closing, the diner felt different, almost ashamed of how loud it had been a few hours earlier. The colored lights still blinked, but now they reflected off empty booths and wiped-down tables, turning the place into a stage after the audience has gone home. Camila swept crumbs into her palm and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rattle of the back door, the tired sighs of co-workers who wanted to forget the night. Her manager avoided her eyes in that careful way people do when they think you might ask for fairness. Camila didn't ask. She'd learned long ago that some people only hear you when you're already leaving. Outside, the winter air hit her face like truth, sharp and clean, and she pulled her jacket tighter as she walked to the bus stop. Houses glowed with warm windows, wreaths, and families inside, and the sight of it didn't make her jealous so much as tired, because happiness always seemed to come with a door she wasn't invited through. The bus arrived with a hiss, and Camilla sat by the window watching Christmas lights smear into long lines in the glass. Her hands still smelled faintly of dish soap and coffee, and her feet ached the way they always did after a double shift. Yet what hurt most was the memory of how quickly the room had decided she was wrong for being kind. At home, her apartment greeted her with thin walls, a flickering hallway light, and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. She set her shoes by the door and stood for a moment in the silence, letting her body finally admit how exhausted it was. On the small table near her bed sat a worn Bible and a rosary her mother had pressed into her palm years ago, back when Camilla still believed life would unfold gently if she did her part. She poured herself a glass of water, and her eyes fell on her own hands, steady hands, capable hands, hands that had learned to care even when no one cared for her. That's when the memories came, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent as a heartbeat. Before the diner, before the apron and the late nights, Camilla had been the kind of girl who studied under harsh fluorescent lights with a notebook full of neat handwriting. She had once been in a nursing program, learning how to soothe panic with a voice, how to turn fear into breath again, how to feed someone slowly without stealing their dignity. She remembered the practice lab, the careful instructions, the quiet pride she'd felt when a professor told her, "Your hands are calm." That matters. Then she remembered the call that pulled her out of that life, family trouble that didn't ask permission, bills that didn't wait, a mother who needed help, and a world that doesn't pause for dreams. Camila hadn't quit because she lacked heart. She'd left because her heart was needed somewhere else. She was still standing in that memory when a sound slipped under her door, soft, deliberate, like something placed there by someone who didn't want to knock. Camilla's stomach tightened as she crouched and pulled an envelope into the light of her kitchen. It was thick, expensive, the kind of paper that announces authority before you even open it. No return address, no holiday message, just a clean printed line that made her breath catch. Whitaker Foundation. Camilla stared at it, feeling the night's humiliation rise again, because this wasn't a tip or a thank you. It felt like reach, like ownership, like the billionaire's world deciding she belonged to it now. She didn't open it right away. She held it in both hands, as if she could feel the intention through the paper, and she listened to the apartment's silence for any sign that she wasn't alone. Her mind raced through possibilities, complaint, threat, payoff, invitation, and none of them felt safe. Camilla finally sat at the small table, the rosary beside her like a quiet witness, and turned the envelope over once more. Whatever was inside, she could sense it already. The night hadn't ended when the diner closed. It had only moved into her home, and it was waiting for her to break the seal. Camilla walked into the diner the next afternoon with the unopened envelope still heavy in her bag, as if paper could carry a verdict. The bells above the door chimed like nothing had happened, and the colored lights still blinked with the same stubborn cheer, pretending last night hadn't turned the room into a courtroom. She told herself she was here to work, to keep her head down, to be small and safe the way life had trained her to be. But her body remembered the silence, the spoon suspended mid-air, the billionaire's calm voice that could ruin her without raising a finger. And the moment she crossed the threshold, she knew the night wasn't finished with her. The manager intercepted her before she could reach the counter, wearing a smile that didn't belong to his eyes. He spoke softly, too softly, guiding her past the kitchen as if he didn't want anyone to hear the sound of power rearranging the day. He led her to a side booth that had been reserved, though Camilla knew nothing in that diner was reserved unless money demanded it. A woman sat there with a tablet and a posture that never relaxed, polished from years of delivering bad news with pleasant words. When the woman said, "Miss Alvarez," Camilla felt her name turn from something personal into something owned. The assistant placed the envelope on the table as if she were setting down a contract, not paper. Her tone was gentle, but the gentleness had edges, the kind used to make refusal feel inappropriate. She spoke of misunderstandings, of privacy, of boundaries, and each word carried the same message beneath it. You stepped into a world you don't understand, and we can close the door on you whenever we want. Camila didn't touch the envelope, because touching it felt like accepting the rules that came with it. She kept her hands folded in her lap and listened, the way you listen when you're trying to recognize whether danger is wearing perfume. Then Graham Whittaker arrived, and the booth seemed smaller the moment he stepped into it. He didn't look angry, he looked decided, like a man who has spent his life believing decisions are the same thing as truth. The diner's noise dulled around him, not because he demanded silence, but because people instinctively gave it, the way they step aside for a storm they can't stop. He sat across from Camila without asking, his suit flawless, his watch catching the light, his eyes calm in a way that felt colder than winter. And in that calm, Camila understood that he wasn't here to apologize. He was here to regain control. He pushed the envelope toward her with 2 fingers, as if money were something that could be slid across a table and turn guilt into cleanliness. He spoke in the language of gifts and gratitude, offering compensation for her trouble, offering an amount that could change her month, maybe her year, maybe her life. The assistant watched closely, waiting for Camila's hands to reach, because that would make everything simple. Kindness could be purchased, silence could be secured, the story could be rewritten. For a heartbeat, Camila felt the temptation rise, not out of greed, but out of exhaustion, the kind that comes from always being one emergency away from falling. Then she thought of Lily's smile, rare and real, and she realized what Graham was really trying to buy wasn't forgiveness. It was ownership of the moment. Camila shook her head slowly and pushed the envelope back without opening it, her voice quiet but steady. She told him she didn't help his daughter for money, and she wouldn't accept money to pretend she hadn't seen what she saw. The assistant's expression tightened in the smallest way, like a door locking. Graham's eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something sharper, something like disbelief that a waitress would refuse the easiest escape. He leaned in just slightly and asked the question that sounded simple but wasn't. How did you know what she needed when no one told you? And as Camila met his gaze, she felt the room shift again, because she could hear the threat hidden inside his calm. If she wouldn't be bought, she might be crushed instead. Camila went back to her section with her face composed and her heart unsteady, because that was the only way to survive in a room where power could rewrite reality. The diner looked unchanged, lights blinking, plates sliding across counters, laughter rising and falling, but something inside it had shifted. She could still feel Graham Whittaker's calm on her skin, the way you feel cold after stepping out of shadow. And even though she'd refused the envelope, she knew refusal was not the end of a conversation with a man like that. It was the beginning of a different kind of pressure. The pressure didn't arrive as a threat, because threats are loud, and loud things can be witnessed. It arrived in softer ways, the manager's eyes lingering too long, the hostess speaking in half-sentences that stopped when Camila walked by. Co-workers who normally joked with her suddenly found reasons to be busy, as if friendliness might become guilt by association. Camila kept working, kept smiling, kept making herself useful, but she could feel the air around her tightening, like a knot pulled one careful inch at a time. 2 days later, the knot became a rule. It was taped to the staff board in crisp, bold letters, too clean to have come from the diner's own tired hands. "Do not approach the Whittaker family," it read, followed by the words that made Camila's throat go dry. "No exceptions." She stared at it longer than she meant to, because in those letters she could hear the real message. Your kindness is a problem we plan to manage." And for the first time, she felt the sting of something deeper than embarrassment, the sting of being told that compassion was a punishable offense. That night, Lily returned with her father, and the booth near the Christmas tree looked like a picture meant to reassure strangers. But Camila could see the truth beneath the glitter. Lily's shoulders were tense, her eyes fixed on her plate as if the food were something she had to earn rather than receive. And Graham sat a little too upright, watching her hands like a supervisor watching a clock. Camila passed by with a tray and felt her instincts pull her toward that table the way a tide pulls at a shoreline, quiet but relentless. She kept walking anyway because the new rule wasn't just ink on paper, it was fear made official. From across the diner, she caught Lily's gaze for a heartbeat, and the child's expression held something that didn't belong in a Christmas-lit room. It wasn't drama or pleading. It was the exhausted hope of someone who has learned not to ask too loudly. Camilla's hands tightened around the tray, and she hated herself for the way obedience began to feel like betrayal. She told herself Lily had her father, her resources, her doctors, her mansion, all the things Camila didn't have, yet none of it seemed to give the girl the one thing Camilla's presence had offered. That thought sat heavy in her chest, because it meant the problem wasn't Lily's body alone, it was the loneliness built around her. Near the end of the shift, the manager pulled Camila aside between the coffee station and the kitchen door, where the noise could swallow a conversation. His voice was low, almost gentle, which made it worse because gentleness can be another form of control when it comes with conditions. "Just do your job," he said, eyes flicking toward the dining room like the walls themselves were listening. "Stay in your lane. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Camila nodded because she had rent due and groceries to buy, but inside she felt something fracture into a quiet, stubborn resolve. Because if kindness was being outlawed in that diner, then sooner or later she would have to decide what kind of person she was willing to become to keep a paycheck. Camila tried to obey the new rule the way people obey storms, by staying out of their path and hoping they pass quickly. She kept her eyes on her own tables, her own tickets, her own small responsibilities, but her attention kept drifting back to the booth near the Christmas tree. Lily sat there like a quiet question no one wanted to answer, and Graham Whittaker sat beside her like an answer written in ink that refused to bend. The diner's lights blinked and blinked, insisting on joy, while Camila felt the opposite growing stronger, the sense that something was wrong in a way money couldn't fix. And the worst part was how normal everyone tried to make it look. Graham's control wasn't loud, but it filled space all the same. He adjusted Lily's napkin, corrected the angle of her cup, moved her plate half an inch as if precision could replace comfort, and every motion carried the same message: "This is how I keep her safe." Camila watched Lily's shoulders tighten each time he spoke in that measured tone, the tone that sounded reasonable until you noticed the fear hiding underneath it. The child didn't fight or cry, she simply grew smaller, retreating into the quiet, the way people do when they learn that asking costs too much. Camila had seen that quiet before, in other places, in other lives, and it always meant the same thing. Someone was carrying more than they should. The diner began to feel split into two worlds, even though it was one room. In one world, customers laughed and exchanged gifts and posed for photos beneath the blinking lights, grateful to be warm and full. In the other, a little girl tried to eat under the pressure of a father who treated each bite like a performance he needed to manage. Camila kept working, but every time she passed near that booth, she heard the clink of Lily's spoon against the plate, small and sharp like a signal. It wasn't dramatic, but it was constant, and constant suffering is the kind that changes a person. Camila could feel her instincts pressing against the protocol like a hand against a locked door. That was when the retired pastor returned, taking his usual seat at the counter with a cup of black coffee and the calm of someone who had learned to watch people the way you watch weather. His name was Reverend Thomas, and he had the kind of voice that didn't rush, the kind that made a crowded place feel briefly quieter. When Camilla refilled his cup, he didn't ask about the rule taped to the staff board, and he didn't ask about the billionaire either. He only looked at her and said, "Some cages don't have bars." Camilla tried to smile it off, but the words landed too close to the truth. Reverend Thomas nodded toward Lily's booth without making it obvious, and his eyes carried a sadness that looked older than the season. Camilla told herself she had no right to judge a father who clearly loved his child in the only way he knew how. She could see the evidence of love in the expensive specialists, the careful routines, the way Graham never left Lily alone. Not really. But she could also see the cost of that love when it came wrapped in pressure, when it demanded progress instead of presence. Graham's gold watch caught the light every time he moved, ticking softly in the pauses, as if time itself were the enemy he was trying to defeat. Camilla realized he wasn't only controlling Lily, he was controlling his own fear of failing her, because fear is easier to manage when it looks like discipline. And still, none of it gave Lily what Camilla had given her without trying, a moment of simple peace. Near the end of the night, as Camilla cleared a table near the booths, she began to hum under her breath without noticing. An old lullaby her mother used to sing when money was tight and hope was thinner than the walls. The melody was quiet, almost accidental, but it softened the air around her like a warm cloth. Camilla looked up and saw Graham turn his head slightly, as if the sound had reached a place in him he kept locked. For a second his face faltered, something cracked, something human tried to rise, and then the mask settled back into place, smooth and controlled. Camilla felt her heart sink, because she could sense the battle inside him, and she didn't know which side would win. Christmas Eve arrived like a wave the diner could barely hold. Families poured in wearing sweaters and rosy cheeks, shaking off the cold and carrying that loud, forced kind of joy people use to convince themselves everything is fine. The Christmas tree near the window glowed like a promise, gifts stacked underneath as decoration more than generosity, and every table seemed to demand warmth on command. Camilla moved faster than usual, balancing trays and smiles while her feet ached, and her mind stayed alert to the one rule that mattered more than any order. She wasn't supposed to approach the Whitakers, not even by accident, not even with kindness. Lily was there again, parked near the tree, as if the season had placed her on display. Camilla tried not to look, but her eyes found the booth anyway, drawn by a quiet struggle that didn't match the holiday lights. Graham sat close, perfectly composed, speaking in that measured tone that sounded like instruction more than comfort. He watched Lily's hands and her plate, as if progress could be demanded from a body that simply needed patience. Lily kept trying, brave in a way that made Camilla's chest hurt, but each attempt seemed to cost her more than it should have. The rush grew louder, the room tighter, until even the air felt crowded. Orders were called, plates clinked, customers laughed, and somewhere behind all that noise, Camilla heard a small sound that didn't belong, sharp, wet, frightened. Lily's face changed in an instant, her chin lifting, her throat working, panic flashing across her eyes like a sudden storm. It wasn't dramatic, not a scene made for attention, but Camilla recognized it immediately, that terrible moment when a child can't find the next breath. And before her fear could remind her of the rule, her body chose the truth. Help her. Camilla was at the booth in seconds, kneeling so she wouldn't tower over Lily, speaking softly the way she had learned long before aprons and tip jars. She guided Lily's posture, encouraged slow breaths, offered water carefully, and kept her voice calm enough to lend Lily courage when her body betrayed her. The room began to notice, not with compassion at first, but with discomfort, the kind people feel when suffering interrupts their celebration. A few heads turned, a few mouths went still, and Camila felt the weight of being watched without having time to care. Lily's breathing steadied, the panic eased, and for a brief moment the world returned to Lily's face like light. Graham surged forward at the same time, his control snapping into anger the way it always did when he felt helpless. He didn't ask what happened, didn't thank her, didn't even look at Lily's calmer eyes before looking at Camila like she had committed a crime. His voice stayed low, but it carried across the booth like a blade, and Camila could feel the old humiliation trying to rise again. The manager appeared as if summoned by money, face tight, hands wringing, desperate to keep the peace with the kind of customer who could change a business's future. "Camila," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "take off your apron." And the diner went quiet in that particular way it does when people sense a public punishment coming and don't want to be remembered as witnesses. Camilla's fingers trembled as she untied the apron strings, not because she was ashamed of helping, but because she knew what it meant to lose a job right before the holidays. She folded the apron slowly, as if folding it carefully could keep her life from unraveling, and she kept her eyes down, so no one could see how hard she was fighting to stay composed. Then Lily reached out, small hand finding Camilla's sleeve with surprising strength, clinging the way a child clings when she knows safety is about to disappear. The touch stopped Camila mid-step, and it stopped the room too, because it was the purest kind of truth, wordless, helpless, undeniable. And when Graham saw his daughter refuse to let go of the waitress he had tried to erase, something in his face shifted, as if he just realized the power he carried had finally met its limit. Camila walked out of the diner, into air so cold it felt like it could scrape the skin from her cheeks, and for a moment she couldn't tell which sting hurt more, the winter or the humiliation she'd been forced to swallow. Behind her, the bells above the door chimed again, bright and indifferent, as if the place were glad to close itself on her and move on. The street was full of headlights and Christmas lights, people carrying bags and laughter, the whole town dressed up in celebration like it had earned it. Camila hugged her arms around herself and kept walking, because standing still would have made her break. And she couldn't afford to break. Not tonight, not with rent waiting like a silent threat. The bus stop was crowded with strangers who looked warm in their coats, and Camila felt suddenly exposed, as if losing her job had stripped away more than an apron. She sat on the bench and stared at the cracks in the sidewalk, while her mind replayed the moment Lily's hand had grabbed her sleeve. That touch had been small, but it had carried a weight Camila couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived a life where comfort is rare and therefore precious. She kept hearing the manager's voice, "Take off your apron," and the way the room had gone quiet, like a jury agreeing. Yet when she closed her eyes, the thing that returned wasn't the humiliation. It was Lily's breathing settling again, the panic leaving, the fragile peace that had arrived only when Camilla's hands did. Her apartment building greeted her with a dim hallway and a smell of old paint and tired heat. Inside her unit, the air was thin and chilly, the heater clicking like it was trying to remember how to help, but failing out of habit. Camila set her bag down and stood there a moment, listening to the silence that always waited for her at home. She turned on the small lamp near the table, and the light fell on the rosary and the worn Bible like they had been waiting too. On the kitchen counter, her last groceries sat in a small line of reality: rice, beans, a carton of eggs, things that suddenly looked like questions. Camila sank into the chair, and the stillness pressed on her chest until she finally let herself exhale. She tried to pray the way her mother had taught her, quietly, without bargaining, but fear has a way of interrupting faith. She asked God why a good act could end like punishment, why kindness always seemed to come with a bill attached, why dignity was treated like disobedience when it came from someone without power. Then she felt ashamed for even asking, because Lily had been the one struggling to breathe, not her. Yet Camila couldn't stop the thoughts that rose like waves. What if I can't find another job? What if the manager tells everyone I'm difficult? What if the Whitakers decide I'm a problem worth removing? Each question landed heavier than the last, and she realized that poverty isn't just lack of money, it's living one step away from losing everything with no warning. Across town, in a mansion that held more rooms than Camila had ever walked through in her life, Graham Whitaker sat in a silence that felt different, but just as cold. The house was decorated perfectly, the tree tall and symmetrical, the presents arranged like photographs waiting to be taken. Yet none of it soothed him, because his mind was trapped in the diner booth where his daughter's hand had chosen someone else. He had tried to tell himself he was protecting Lily, teaching independence, enforcing strength, but the truth kept pushing back. Lily had calmed only when Camila had spoken to her like a person, not a project. Graham poured himself a drink he didn't want, stared at it, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel powerful. He felt afraid. Afraid that he had built a life where everything could be purchased except the one thing his daughter needed most. In Lily's room, a nurse adjusted blankets and tried to coax a few bites from her, but Lily turned her face away with quiet stubbornness. She wasn't throwing a tantrum. She was withdrawing, closing the door on a world that had made eating feel like pressure and shame. When Graham stepped closer, Lily's eyes moved past him, as if searching for someone who wasn't there, and that hurt him in a place money couldn't reach. He wanted to tell himself Camila had overstepped, that rules existed for reasons, that control was the same thing as care. But he couldn't forget the way Lily had held on, small fingers gripping fabric, like it was the last safe thing in the room. And the worst part was realizing that his authority hadn't comforted his daughter. It had only made her lonelier. Back in her apartment, Camila stared at the ceiling until her eyes blurred, then finally rose and placed the envelope she'd refused on the table in front of her, as if laying it down could keep it from growing heavier in her bag. She didn't open it. Not yet, because opening it felt like letting Graham step into her life again. But she could sense the shape of what was coming. A phone call, a demand, an offer that would sound generous and feel like a leash. Camila pressed her palm to her chest and tried to steady her breathing, the way she had steadied Lily's, reminding herself that fear is loudest right before dawn. Still, as the heater clicked and the night deepened, one thought refused to let her rest. Because somewhere out there, a little girl was hungry and scared, and the man with all the power in the world didn't know how to reach her. The morning after Christmas Eve felt quieter than it should have, as if the town had used up all its warmth in one night and now didn't know what to do with the cold truth left behind. Camila woke with her throat tight and her mind already replaying the diner, the manager's voice, the apron in her hands, and Lily's small fingers gripping her sleeve. She tried to eat a piece of toast but couldn't, not because she wasn't hungry, but because hunger is hard to honor when shame is sitting at theatable first. She washed her face, smoothed her hair back, and told herself she would find another job, because people like her always do. Still, the unopened envelope on her table watched her like a silent dare. By late morning, there was a knock at her door, steady and patient, the kind that didn't demand. When Camila opened it, Reverend Thomas stood in the hallway with his coat buttoned and his eyes calm, as if he had walked through worse storms than gossip and billionaires. He didn't start with questions or advice. He simply held out a paper bag with a warm roll inside and said softly that no one should face Christmas with an empty stomach or an empty heart. Camila tried to refuse out of pride, but the pastor's kindness was gentle in a way that didn't feel like charity. It felt like recognition. Then he told her he had been at the diner. He had seen what happened, and he wasn't going to let the story be written by the richest man in the room. Reverend Thomas invited her to the church kitchen, where volunteers were preparing meals for anyone who needed one. No explanations required. The church basement smelled of soup and bread and steam, and the sound of people working together carried a different kind of music than the diner's forced holiday playlist. Camila tied on a borrowed apron and found her hands remembering their purpose, moving steadily as she portioned food and wiped counters and offered smiles that didn't feel like a performance. People thanked her in quiet voices, not because they were impressed, but because they were relieved, and that relief warmed her more than any Christmas light ever had. For a few hours, Camila felt something she hadn't felt in days. Useful without being threatened, seen without being judged. While she worked, Reverend Thomas spoke to her the way he spoke to everyone, without drama, but with the weight of truth. He told her he had known the Whitaker name long before Graham became the town's untouchable legend, and he had known Graham's mother before illness took her softness away. He described a family that treated perfection like salvation and tenderness like weakness, a family that measured love in results and control in silence. Camila listened, and the pieces began to fit together in a way that made her uneasy, because it meant Graham's coldness wasn't only arrogance, it was fear dressed up as authority. The pastor didn't excuse him, but he didn't flatten him into a villain either. He simply said that some men build cages so carefully they forget they're locked inside them too. Across town the cage was tightening. Lily refused breakfast, then refused lunch, turning her face away even when nurses followed every instruction with professional precision. She wasn't being difficult. She was withdrawing, conserving herself, as if each bite demanded trust she no longer had. Graham watched the untouched plate like it was an accusation, and for the first time, the numbers in his world couldn't solve the problem. Money couldn't persuade appetite, and authority couldn't command comfort. He called specialists, demanded updates, adjusted routines, and still Lily's eyes drifted toward the door as if waiting for a gentleness that didn't live in that house. The fear in Graham grew sharper because he realized he had spent years buying solutions while forgetting the simplest ingredient, presence. By late afternoon, a message arrived through channels that didn't feel official, but carried the unmistakable weight of influence. A request for Camila to come, privately, quietly, just once. Camila stood in the church kitchen holding her phone, listening to the hiss of simmering soup and the soft voices of volunteers around her, and she felt the old instinct to protect herself rise like a shield. Saying yes could pull her back into danger. Saying no could leave Lily trapped in a world of control that didn't know how to soften. Reverend Thomas didn't push her. He only looked at her with steady eyes and reminded her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do right while fear is still speaking. Camila took a slow breath, and in that breath she understood the request wasn't really about food. It was about a powerful man finally admitting he didn't know how to reach his own child. Camila agreed to meet Graham Whitaker on one condition: no cameras, no audience, no strings disguised as kindness. She told Reverend Thomas where she was going, not because she needed permission, but because she needed someone to know the truth if the powerful tried to twist it. The request felt simple on the surface: help a child eat. But Camila could hear the deeper meaning beneath it. If Lily only trusted her, then Camila had become a key to a door Graham couldn't open alone. And keys, in the wrong hands, can be used to lock people in as easily as they can set them free. A black car arrived at the curb, like a quiet command, clean and patient, waiting for Camila to step into a world that had never made space for her. The driver spoke politely, but his politeness had the same practiced shape as everything else connected to wealth. Camila watched the city slide past the window, the familiar streets giving way to larger gates, cleaner sidewalks, taller hedges, as if money could prune life into silence. She kept her hands folded tight in her lap, reminding herself she was not going to beg, not going to perform, not going to be purchased. Yet her heart wouldn't stop picturing Lily's face because that was the only reason she was there. The Whitaker mansion looked like a postcard someone framed to prove they had won, bright and perfect and distant from anything that could stain it. Inside, everything smelled faintly of expensive candles and polished wood, and every surface shined like it had never been touched by human worry. Camila followed a quiet hallway where framed photographs showed Graham in suits, in boardrooms, in places where smiling was a strategy. She noticed there were fewer pictures of Lily than there should have been, and even the ones that existed looked staged, like proof instead of memory. The house felt less like a home and more like a museum built around control. Graham met her near the dining room, and the first thing Camila saw was not arrogance, but exhaustion he hadn't managed to hide. His voice was still calm, but it carried a rough edge now, as if he'd spent the day losing arguments with reality. He didn't apologize in a grand way. He simply said Lily wouldn't eat, and he didn't know what else to do. The words sounded like surrender, in a language he'd never spoken before. Camila studied him carefully, because she had learned that desperation can be sincere, but it can also be dangerous. In Lily's chair, the child looked smaller than she had in the diner, as if the quiet luxury around her made her feel even more alone. A nurse hovered nearby with a clipboard, and the air felt thick with instructions, schedules, and unspoken fear of doing the wrong thing. Camila knelt so Lily wouldn't have to look up, and she spoke softly, using the same gentle tone she used for frightened strangers in the church kitchen. Lily's eyes flicked toward Camilla's face, searching, and something in her shoulders loosened just a fraction. When Camila lifted the spoon, Lily didn't flinch the way she flinched for the others. She simply watched, as if her body recognized safety before her mind could explain why. Graham stood behind them, silent, and Camila could feel him fighting the urge to take control of every second. She could almost hear the thoughts in him, faster, cleaner, better, the same thoughts that had turned a child's meal into a test. Camila fed Lily slowly, letting her choose the pace, letting her swallow without being rushed, letting her breathe without being watched like a stopwatch. In the stillness, Lily accepted a bite, then another, and the room shifted in a way money couldn't command. And when Graham finally spoke again, his question landed like a quiet threat wrapped in politeness. He wanted Camila to stay, because once you give a powerful man what he can't buy, he starts believing he has the right to keep it. Camila didn't answer Graham's request right away, because she had learned that stay can mean safety in one mouth and captivity in another. She cleaned Lily's lips gently, asked if she wanted a sip of water, and waited until the child nodded before moving again, letting Lily's body lead instead of an adult's impatience. The nurse watched with professional surprise, as if calm were an unfamiliar method in this house. Graham hovered near the edge of the room, arms tense, eyes fixed on every detail, like he was afraid a single imperfect second would undo him. And Camila, kneeling beside Lily, felt the truth pressing closer. This wasn't just about feeding, it was about what fear had turned this home into. When Lily finally rested back against her chair, Camila noticed the small things that didn't belong to care. The straps were too tight, not cruelly, but thoughtlessly, like someone had prioritized control over comfort. There were faint marks on Lily's skin where equipment had rubbed, and a guarded flinch when the nurse raised her voice even slightly. Camila didn't accuse anyone, not yet, but her chest tightened with a familiar ache, the ache of realizing a child had learned to brace herself instead of relax. She asked the nurse, gently, what Lily's routine was like. The nurse hesitated, then answered with a list of protocols and schedules so rigid they sounded more like a corporate plan than a child's life. In the hallway afterward, the nurse spoke more quietly, as if the walls might report back. She mentioned specialists flown in, assessments repeated, therapies pushed hard, and an experimental program Graham had funded because he couldn't bear the idea of waiting. It wasn't framed as cruelty, it was framed as urgency, as if time itself were the enemy and tenderness a luxury they couldn't afford. Camila listened, and the shape of it unsettled her, because she had seen this before in different forms, people trying to outrun pain by tightening their grip. The nurse admitted Lily often did better when things were slower, softer, less pressured. Then she swallowed and added, almost like a confession, that Lily's condition wasn't the only struggle in that house. The fear around her had become its own illness. Graham returned, trying to speak casually, but his questions landed like calculations. He asked what Camila had done differently, what words she used, what angle she held the spoon, as if kindness could be reverse-engineered into a system. Camila told him it wasn't a trick. It was trust, and trust takes time. Graham's jaw tightened at the word, not because he disagreed, but because it demanded something he didn't know how to give without controlling it. He said he could pay her, hire her, make this official, and Camila felt the old danger rise again, the way powerful men turn help into ownership. She reminded him calmly that Lily wasn't a project, and that progress without peace isn't progress at all. When Graham stepped away to take a call, Camila followed the nurse down a quieter corridor and caught sight of a door left slightly ajar. An office, immaculate and silent. She didn't mean to intrude, but her eyes landed on a familiar logo stamped on a folder near the edge of a desk. Whitaker Foundation. The same name printed on the envelope that had appeared under her door like a shadow with good manners. Camila felt her pulse quicken as she saw paperwork spread out with charts, meeting notes, and a report half covered by a closed laptop. She should have turned away. Instead, she took one step closer and saw a page with typed lines that made the room tilt beneath her feet. Her name was there. Camila Alvarez, printed cleanly, alongside details she had never given anyone in this world. Old school information, a record of her nursing coursework, even a note about clinical aptitude that sounded like it came from someone who had been watching her from a distance for a long time. Her fingers went cold as she realized this wasn't a random investigation that started after the diner. It felt older, prepared, planned. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Graham standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt heavier than any threat. Then Graham's voice dropped to something almost honest as he said, "I knew who you were, before you ever lifted that spoon." And Camila understood the real story had been waiting in the dark long before Christmas Eve. Camila didn't step away from the desk, because stepping away felt like surrendering the truth back into Graham's hands. The paper with her name on it lay between them, like a blade set carefully on a polished surface, too sharp to pretend it wasn't there. She kept her voice low, not out of fear but out of control, her own control, the kind that doesn't come from money. "You didn't just look me up," she said, watching his face for the smallest crack. "You've been tracking me." And in the stillness of that office, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a place where people were collected and catalogued. Graham's jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, he looked like the man from the diner again, composed, offended, ready to turn blame into policy. He said he had a responsibility, that Lily's safety required certainty, that strangers around his daughter were risks he couldn't afford. Camila listened, then shook her head because she'd heard that language before in different uniforms. For your own good, for safety, for order. Safety isn't the same as control, she replied, and the words landed harder than shouting because they were calm. Graham's eyes narrowed, not with cruelty, but with the discomfort of a man being seen too clearly. And Camila understood then that the scariest thing to him wasn't her anger. It was her refusal to be intimidated. He admitted more than he intended because the truth has a way of slipping out when fear is cornered. He told her he noticed Lily's reaction in the diner, and it scared him, not because Lily smiled, but because she smiled at someone else. He said he needed to know what kind of woman could reach his daughter in seconds when he, with all his resources, could not. Camila felt a surge of something bitter in her chest, not envy, but grief for a child whose father had turned love into a competition he was determined to win. "You're treating her like a problem to solve," she said, and she could see the words hit him where his armor was thinnest. Graham's face hardened again, but his voice faltered, because part of him knew she was right. Before either of them could say more, the sound of Lily's distress rose from down the hall, small at first, then sharper, like a thread being pulled too tight. The argument stopped mid-breath, not because they reached understanding, but because a child's panic doesn't care about adult pride. Camila moved first, not as a waitress or a subject in Graham's world, but as someone who recognized fear. Lily sat in her chair with her shoulders rigid, breath short, eyes wide, her body bracing as if the room itself had become unsafe. The nurse hovered with instructions on her face, and Graham stepped closer with urgency that still carried command, making the air feel even tighter. Camila knelt beside Lily and lowered her voice until it became a kind of shelter. She didn't rush the spoon or the water. She focused on breath, on pace, on giving Lily back the sense that she still owned her own body. "Slow," Camila murmured, matching Lily's gaze, letting the child see calm before she could feel it. Lily's breathing began to settle, but the moment Graham leaned in with that sharp intensity, "Try now, swallow now, you can do it," Lily flinched and the panic surged again. Camila turned her head toward Graham, and her look was steady enough to stop him more effectively than any raised voice. "Not like that," she said quietly. "Not like a test." For a long second, Graham stood frozen, caught between the instinct to command and the need to comfort. Camila didn't shame him. She gave him something harder, an invitation to do the simple thing that power can't substitute. "Sit," she told him, gesturing to the chair beside Lily. "Close. Not above her. With her." Graham hesitated, as if closeness were a language he'd forgotten, then sat down slowly, his expensive suit creasing like proof he was finally bending. Camila guided his hand toward Lily's, not forcing, just offering. And when Lily's fingers met his, her shoulders softened a fraction. Graham didn't speak, he didn't instruct, he just held on, awkward, quiet, present. When Lily finally took a calmer breath, the room changed in a way nothing in that mansion had prepared for. Graham looked down at his daughter's hand in his, as if he had been searching the world for an answer, and it had been here the whole time. Camila rose slowly, her heart still pounding, and met Graham's eyes with a truth he couldn't buy and couldn't erase. "If you want me to help," she said, voice gentle but firm, "you don't get to own it, and you don't get to use Lily's need as a leash." Graham swallowed, and for the first time, his power seemed small next to the quiet fear of losing what mattered most. And in that uneasy silence, Camila could feel it coming, the moment he would either change or tighten his grip until everything broke. The next morning, Graham Whittaker called Camila before the sun had fully warmed the windows, and his voice sounded different. Not softer exactly, but less certain of its usual authority. He asked her to come back, not as a favor, not as staff, but as someone whose presence Lily responded to when nothing else worked. Camila listened without interrupting because she could hear the fear hiding behind his careful words, and fear can make even powerful men sound like strangers to themselves. She told him she would help Lily, but she would not be hired like a tool, and she would not be threatened into silence. There was a pause long enough to feel like a test. And then Graham agreed, because for once his pride couldn't win without costing him his daughter. He did something else that surprised her even more. He returned to the diner that same afternoon, not through a back door and not through an assistant. The place was busy again, trying to pretend Christmas Eve hadn't happened, trying to fold the shame into the routine the way small places often do. Camila wasn't there anymore, and everyone seemed to believe that made the story simpler. Graham stood at the entrance in his tailored coat, and the chatter dimmed in pieces as heads turned, because wealth always pulls attention like gravity. He asked for the manager, and the manager appeared with a smile that looked like fear trying to behave. Graham didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand a performance. He simply said clearly that Camila had been wronged, and that it would be corrected. The manager tried to explain policy and protocol, the same words that had been used like shields, but Graham cut through them with the calm precision of a man who finally recognized what those words had cost. He told the manager to reinstate Camila immediately, with back pay for the days she'd been forced out, and he said it in front of staff who had watched her be humiliated. Then he did something even rarer than that. He turned toward the dining room, where customers could hear, and admitted he had been wrong on Christmas Eve. It wasn't a speech meant for applause. It was a sentence he seemed to force out of his own pride, like pulling a thorn from skin that had grown around it. Camila heard about it from a co-worker before Graham even had a chance to tell her himself. She stood in her apartment holding the phone, feeling the strange mix of relief and suspicion that comes when justice arrives wearing a billionaire's name. Part of her wanted to trust it because Lily mattered, and because rent mattered, and because everyone gets tired of fighting to be treated like a person. Another part of her watched for the hidden hook in the kindness, the way offers sometimes come, with strings that tighten later. Camila called Reverend Thomas, and he listened quietly before telling her something she already knew in her bones. True change isn't proven by gifts, it's proven by what someone is willing to lose. Camila took a long breath and decided she would return, but she would return with her eyes open. At the mansion, Graham met her in the entryway and didn't try to charm her with apologies shaped like transactions. He looked tired, and his tiredness made him seem more human than any of his polished photographs ever had. He told her Lily had eaten better that morning when he sat beside her and said nothing, just held her hand and let her breathe at her own pace. The confession landed quietly, but it carried weight because it meant he had done the one thing he had always avoided. He had stopped trying to win. Camila nodded because she understood how hard that simple choice could be for someone trained to measure everything in outcomes. She reminded him again that Lily's dignity came first, even when progress was slow, and Graham didn't argue. He only asked what first looked like in real life. Over the next days, Lily's meals became smaller battles and more moments of trust. Camila didn't rush her, didn't praise her like a project, didn't treat her body like something that owed anyone improvement. She spoke softly, gave Lily choices, let her stop when she needed to stop, and celebrated calm more than success. Graham watched at first like a man studying a method, but little by little he began to watch like a father learning his child's language. He sat closer, kept his voice lower, softened his hands, and when impatience rose in him, he caught it before it reached Lily's face. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was real. And real was the one thing money could never manufacture. When Camila returned to the diner for her first shift back, she walked in with her shoulders squared and her heart steady, refusing to let the past decide her posture. The manager mumbled something that sounded like an apology, but lacked the courage to be one, and Camila accepted it without rewarding it, because she didn't need him to be good, she needed him to be fair. A small envelope waited in her locker, not thick like the first one, not official, not threatening. Inside was a note in plain handwriting from Graham. "Thank you for not letting my fear be louder than my daughter's needs." Camila read it once, then folded it carefully, because gratitude written without ownership is rare. And as she stepped onto the floor with the Christmas light still blinking above her, she felt the story shifting again, toward a confrontation that wouldn't be fought with money, but with truth. Camila could feel the shift before anyone announced it, the way you feel weather change when the air turns too still. The mansion began to fill with voices that didn't carry warmth, only confidence. People who spoke as if the house belonged to them more than it belonged to Lily. Cars arrived in a quiet procession, and shoes clicked across marble floors like punctuation marks in a sentence Graham didn't get to finish. The Christmas decorations remained flawless, but the mood underneath them sharpened, turning holiday into theater and family into a board meeting. Camila stayed close to Lily because she had learned that when adults fight for control, children become the collateral without anyone saying the word. They entered the dining room in layers, relatives dressed in expensive grief and polite smiles, advisors with folders, and board members who wore concern like a tailored jacket. A woman with Graham's eyes but none of his exhaustion looked at Camila as if she were a stain on white linen, then looked at Lily as if Lily were a risk to be managed. Another man spoke about public perception, liability, and security, the same language Camila had heard in the diner when compassion was treated like a violation. They didn't accuse her directly at first. They simply asked questions that were shaped like traps. Who are you? Why you? How much are you being paid? And every question carried the same assumption. No one helps for free unless they're taking something. Graham tried to keep his voice calm, but Camila could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands hovered between clenched and open. He said Lily was doing better, that the new pace was helping, that trust mattered more than pressure, and his relatives listened the way powerful people listen when they're waiting to disagree. One of them slid a document across the table, a temporary custody recommendation, dressed up in legal softness that still smelled like threat. Another mentioned headlines and investors as if Lily's life were a stock price that needed protecting. They claimed Camila was unvetted, inappropriate, a stranger influencing a vulnerable child. And the words landed with the cold certainty of people who believe their wealth makes their fears valid. Camila felt her stomach tighten because she understood what they were really doing. They were trying to remove her without looking cruel. Then they turned the knife by pretending it was paperwork. They produced a background file so thick it looked like it had been built long before Christmas Eve, and Camila felt the room tilt when she recognized details no one had the right to hold. Her nursing program, the semester she left, the address she lived at when her mother got sick, a hospital bill, a late rent notice from years ago that should have stayed buried with the worst part of her life. They framed it all as due diligence, but Camila could hear the message beneath it: you are small, and we can prove it. Her cheeks burned, not from shame at her past, but from rage that her survival had been turned into ammunition. Lily sensed it before anyone spoke her name, because children always feel the temperature of a room more honestly than adults do. Her hands began to tremble, her eyes searching for Camila with a fear that wasn't about food or pain. It was about being pulled away from the only calm she trusted. Camila moved closer, kept her voice low, reminded Lily to breathe, and felt her own heart crack at how quickly safety could be threatened by people who insisted they were protecting her. One of the relatives suggested Lily needed consistent professional care, and the nurse shifted uncomfortably, because even she could hear the lie hiding inside that sentence. Graham looked at Lily's face, then at Camilla's, and something in him finally hardened, not into pride, but into resolve. He stepped between Camila and the table, and the room went quiet in the way it does when a powerful man stops performing for other powerful people. Graham said clearly that Camila wasn't going anywhere, and that Lily would not be treated like an asset to be safeguarded for reputation's sake. When they threatened him, board consequences, lawsuits, public scandal, he didn't flinch the way he used to. He reached into his jacket, pulled out an envelope, and laid it on the polished table with a steadiness that made everyone's eyes widen. "If you want leverage," he said, voice controlled but trembling at the edges, "here it is." Camila stared as he slid the envelope forward, because the word printed at the top was unmistakable, resignation, and in that instant she realized Graham was about to burn down his old life to protect a new one. While the people across from him smiled like they already knew how to win, the silence after Graham slid the resignation letter across the table felt heavier than any threat his family had tried to weaponize. For the first time, their polished confidence hesitated, because they weren't used to a Whittaker choosing love over leverage. Camila watched their faces tighten and rearrange, as if they were searching for a new script that could put Graham back in his place. One of the board members spoke first, voice smooth and offended, warning him about investors, lawsuits, and the damage he was willing to cause. Graham didn't argue with numbers the way he normally would. He simply looked past them, toward the doorway where Lily sat trembling, and his expression made the room understand something they hadn't prepared for. He would rather lose power than lose her. Camila kept her hand near Lily's, her body angled like a shield, because children can't defend themselves against adults who speak in polite cruelty. Lily's breathing was shallow at first, then steadier as Camila murmured slow words and held Themament still, refusing to let panic become the new normal. When one relative tried to step closer and speak to Lily in a bright, performative tone, Lily turned her face away, small shoulders curling inward as if she already knew that kind of care came with a price. Graham noticed, and something in him softened and strengthened at once. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Not like that." And the firmness in that sentence was different from his old firmness, this one protected instead of controlled. The confrontation ended the way most battles end, when truth finally enters the room. Not with applause, but with retreat. The relatives left in clusters, making promises that sounded like threats, and threats that sounded like concern, because that's how people protect themselves when they lose moral ground. A lawyer muttered about paperwork. A board member warned about consequences. Someone suggested Graham was not thinking clearly. Graham only nodded once, not agreeing, but acknowledging that consequences were real and that he was choosing them anyway. When the last footsteps faded, the mansion felt quieter than before, as if it could finally exhale. Camila looked at the resignation letter still on the table and realized the powerful man wasn't offering drama. He was offering proof. In the days that followed, the change was not sudden like a miracle, but steady like healing. Graham restructured Lily's care plan with a different center. Comfort first, dignity always, progress measured in peace instead of performance. He insisted on a gentler routine, shorter sessions, more choice, and he began showing up not as a supervisor but as a father, present, imperfect, learning. Camila stayed involved with clear boundaries and fair pay, refusing to let her kindness be turned into unpaid obligation. Reverend Thomas visited quietly, not to congratulate anyone, but to remind them that redemption isn't a single decision. It's a way of living, practiced daily. And slowly Lily's body began to trust the world again, in small ways that mattered more than milestones. On Christmas morning, the diner opened its doors for a community meal, and the same blinking lights that once felt fake now looked softer, almost honest. Camila stood behind the counter, serving plates with steady hands, surrounded by volunteers who offered warmth without judgment. People came in with tired faces and empty wallets and grateful eyes, and Camila realized how much strength lives in ordinary places when kindness is allowed to breathe. Later, Graham arrived without a procession, without assistance, carrying Lily in a way that looked careful rather than controlling. He sat with her at a corner table and fed her slowly, letting her set the rhythm, letting her pause, letting her be a child instead of a project. And when Lily smiled, small, rare, real, it landed on both of them this time, like the world finally making room for what money can't buy. That afternoon, Camila stepped outside for a moment and watched snow drift down in thin, quiet flakes, the kind that make everything look new without erasing what was there before. She thought about how close she had come to being broken by humiliation, and how one small act of care had turned into a doorway for someone else's change. Graham had learned, painfully, that control is not love, and that a father's strength isn't proven by results, it's proven by tenderness when no one is watching. Camila had learned something too. Dignity doesn't come from being protected by the powerful, it comes from refusing to stop being good when the world tries to punish you for it. And if this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.